Hello friends, welcome back to this section. In this module, we are going to talk about the AIIMS exam which was conducted in June 2020. It was conducted after a lot of confusion, but whether will it be conducted yes or no because of the COVID pandemic. But anyways, the exam was conducted and it was seen that this MCQ exam was slightly different from the conventional MCQ exam pattern that we get in AIIMS exam. The difference that I observed regarding community medicine MCQs were that around 7 to 8 MCQs were only from communicable disease or the related national health programs for communicable disease, which is usually not the case. We have 7-8 MCQs from epidemiology, but this year no MCQ was there from epidemiology, none was there from screening of disease. We had 2 MCQs from biostats. We had 2 MCQs from biomedical waste management, 2 MCQs from nutrition. So it was fairly balanced exam on a relatively lower or easier scale, I would say, but unconventional topics were included, and conventional topics like epidemiology, screening of disease, which we all know is very nicely asked in AIIMS exam, was not there this time. But anyways, that's how the exams are, and we need to take exams in a good positive sense. So I would like to discuss the MCQ which were recall based. I would like to give a disclaimer that under no circumstances these MCQs are the real MCQs, because these are all recall based and they may differ and they must be differing from what came in the real exam. So don't think that, sir, this option was not there or this question was not there. My main motive was to discuss the topic in this module. So let's go and see the first MCQ. Glasgow Coma Scale, or the GCS, what you call them, is classified as what data type? Is it alphanumeric, nominal, ordinal, or interval? It's a very relatively easier type of MCQ because it is based on the conventional topic of what are the data types. So you all know that data is of 4 types. You have nominal data, you have ordinal data, you have interval data, and we have a ratio data. Nominal data is pure qualitative type of data, in which in nominal data, we will only talk of countable type of data. For example, type of disease or number of people who are healthy, number of people who are diseased, or things like this. It's a pure qualitative. Ordinal is when there are ranks. Example, grades or stages. Interval data, there is only one example, that is degree Celsius, and ratio data is a pure quantitative type of scale. Example for this could be weight, example for this could be height, your forced expiratory volumes, and so on and so forth. So Glasgow Coma Scale, we all know it's a scale where we try to assess the consciousness level of a person, and we classify that based on the eye response, the verbal response, and the motor response, EVM. So 4, 5, and 6. So 4 points, 5 points, and 6 points. And after we take this GCS, we classify the data, the person, into mild, moderate, or severe. So moderate is 9 to 12. So more than 13 is mild, or it could be normal, or it is very minor injury, and severe is when it is less than 8. So basically GCS you classify on mild, moderate, severe scale. So it's a very direct MCQ. The answer would be ordinal data. Let's see the next MCQ. Which of the following is a non-parametric test? Friedman test, student t-test, ANOVA test, or Pearson test? So which is a non-parametric test? Non-parametric and parametric tests. You all must have listened to this module in my previous lectures, or you must have read it somewhere, that the test of significance can be of 2 types. We can have the parametric test or the non-parametric test. We can have the parametric test or the non-parametric test. Just grossly speaking, just to give you a hint, that for all the quantitative data we have the parametric test, for qualitative data we have the non-parametric test. You must have seen a chart like this, which I had put on social media as well. I know you might be seeing these as ants in your screen right now, but I'll just zoom them. So on this side you have the parametric test, you have the parametric test. On the other hand, you have the non-parametric test. So let me just zoom in into the non-parametric test of significance. If you look at the screen right now, the non-parametric test of significance, you need to remember that non-parametric test of significance could be very easy. You need to remember very important, couple of times MCQs has been asked, especially in NEET exam, DNV exams, chi-square test. So it's a non-parametric test. It's a chi-square test. For ordinal data, we have something called as a rank test, Wilcoxon rank test, that is for ordinal data. For two groups, we have chi-square. So you need to remember two things, chi-square and rank test. Third thing that you need to remember over here, that for single group, one group, you have a McNemer test. That's all. So you need to remember three things from this area, non-parametric test. Where do you use non-parametric? You use them for nominal data or ordinal data. We just not talked in the previous MCQ for this. On the other hand, if I take the screen to the left side, and now if I have zoomed in and we see that normal distribution for normally distributed data, which is either a ratio data or an interval data, we use the parametric test. Parametric test, you need to remember three things. Parametric test example would be something called as t-test. You can see there is a t-test. T-test. Remember t-test. So whenever there is single group, it is a paired t-test. Two groups, unpaired t-test. Please speak with me. Please repeat with me. One group, paired t-test. Two groups, unpaired t-test. On the other hand, if you recall, on the non-parametric side, two groups, what was the answer? For two groups, we had the chi-square test. For single group on qualitative side, non-parametric test, you remember it was the McNemer test for single group. In this quantitative side, for single group, we have the paired t-test, two groups, unpaired t-test. And we have to remember that for more than two groups, we have analysis of variance called as ANOVA test. ANOVA. Analysis of variance called as ANOVA test. And for coefficient, for understanding the degree of a relationship, for the strength of relationship and the direction of relationship, we do a Pearson correlation coefficient. So all these tests are parametric tests. So just to remind you again that parametric test is for qualitative data. Quantitative data, non-parametric test. Parametric, just now you have learned that there could be t-test. You also have learned there could be ANOVA test. You also have learned there could be a Pearson correlation coefficient. So if you look at these MCQs, I'm not saying that you should know what is a Friedman test. See, there are around 200 plus tests of significance. I can't tell you each test of significance. Even I don't know all the tests of significance. We use computers these days. But you should be knowing that student t-test, ANOVA t-test, Pearson t-test, these are all under the quantitative data. So therefore, these are the parametric test of significance. So what is the answer over here? The answer is direct answer. It's a Friedman test. Friedman test is a non-parametric test. It is usually used for ordinal data. So it's a specialized test. So I know that many of you must not be knowing, but even if you have listened to my modules, I talked again and again that even if you are able to rule out 2 or 3 options, you should be able to get an answer right. Okay. So let's move forward to the next MCQ. Next MCQ, latex gloves are discarded in yellow bag, red bag, white bag, green bag. So this question is such a frequently asked question, even on social media. I think most of you must be knowing it. It's almost every alternate day, every single day I have to give an answer to the questions on biomedical waste. It's such a burning hot topic these days. Biomedical waste, you all please remember that gloves are always discarded in red category. Gloves are always discarded in red category. They may be bloodstained, they may not be bloodstained, but it always goes in the red category. Remember that yellow category, red category, blue category and white category. These are the 4 categories: yellow, red, blue and white. Yellow, please remember, anything which is infectious, which needs to be burnt, incinerated, we use the yellow category. Red category is for rubbers, tubes or plastics. Blue category is for glass, And please remember, white category is for sharps. So where does the metal go? Metal also goes with sharps. But body implants, metallic body implants are in the blue category. So please remember this by heart: yellow, red, blue and white for sharps and metals. So if you look at the Government of India guidelines also, so I don't know how good you can see it on the screen, but I've tried to zoom in as much as we can. So if you look at this, if you look at the screen, you can see that in the red category, red bin with red non-chlorinated plastic bags, which is more than 50 microns. In this red category, in this red bin, we discard all the items which you are seeing on the screen: Foley's catheter, Euro bags, IV bottle and drip set, heavy duty rubber gloves, syringe without needle, vacutainers and Royal's tube. So under this red category, what is the treatment now? Please remember that if there is a common biomedical waste treatment facility available, we will autoclave, microwave, chemical disinfection followed by shredding in case it is required to shred. So this is the guideline for red category. I am also going to show you the direct Ministry of Health and Family Welfare guidelines, and which were also released by the Pollution Control Board guidelines for red category. Usually the PSM people or the national health programs, they don't give such simple English language. But this is one guideline, as you can see on the screen, which is using so lucid and simplistic guideline that I don't know why again there is so many doubts. Maybe because for the first time you're seeing such simple guidelines that makes you feel that, get that doubt again. But anyways, let's have a look. I'll read line by line to dissolve most of your doubts. Red category waste is a contaminated recyclable waste containing primarily plastics generated from disposable items as tubes, bottles, IV tubes, sets, catheter, urine bags, syringes without needles. Remember, without needles, and fixed needle syringes with their needles cut. So syringes, if they are with the needles, they should be cut and then disposed in the red category. Otherwise, the syringes should be without the needles. Vacutainers and gloves. This also includes waste pipettes, plastic pipettes, all these drains, oxygen masks, plastic splash proof gowns and all these things. Okay. So please remember, red category is for all the rubber, tube and plastic. It all goes into the red category. Okay. So based on this, what is your answer over here? Latex gloves after use are discarded in yellow bag, no. White bag, no. Green bag, nothing. Answer is a red bag. So let us look at the next MCQ. Pacemakers to be discarded in which bag? Blue cardboard bags, yellow bag, white bag or puncture proof containers. I know that AIIMS MCQ examiners, they are known to be putting MCQs on very controversial topic, and pacemaker to be disposed of or to be reused is an internationally debated controversial topic. A lot of controversies are there that pacemakers are not intended to be reused, so we should dispose them. But in developing countries and in low resource setting countries, disposal of pacemakers by single use does not give a very cost benefit ratios, so we tend to reuse them. And India is one of the country where we tend to reuse the pacemakers in case it has life of more than 60 to 70%. So pacemakers are disposed of in which bag? In India we take it as a blue cardboard box. Yellow bag, no answer. White bag, nothing. Puncture proof gives you a dilemma that maybe this is the answer, but there is nothing called as a puncture proof container. It has to be a color coded container. So therefore I would not like to go with this D option. I would like to mark option A, that is blue cardboard box. Please remember, blue category, we discard glass and body implants. Primarily, these are all orthopedic implants, but it also includes pacemaker without the battery. Please remember, pacemaker without the batteries. So this, you can see the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare guidelines. I've taken a screenshot from the guidelines. Blue category, metallic body implants and glassware goes into a puncture proof, leak proof boxes or containers with blue color marking. It has to be a blue colored marking. So it has to be a blue cardboard box or a blue bin. So let's have a look at the next MCQ. Which of the following is incorrect regarding Ebola virus? Mosquito transmission, nosocomial infection, belongs to Flavoviridae family or spreads by direct contact. So let's have a look at the Ebola virus disease. Ebola virus is having 5 subtypes. We can have Zaire, Sudan, Bundibugyo, Thai forest, or Reston type. Out of these, the first 3, that is Zaire, Sudan and Bundibugyo, these cause the human disease, the Ebola virus disease in humans. If you talk about Ebola epidemiology, the incubation period is ranging from 2 to 21 days. It has a good reasonable amount of case fatality rate. Different researchers show 25 to 90%. Average, we can always say it has up to 50% case fatality rate, which is pretty bad in sense. Ebola, if you talk about what is the mode of transmission, it is primarily a zoonotic disease, and in fact it is an anthropozoonotic disease. It's an anthropozoonotic disease. What does anthropozoonotic mean? That it is basically a zoonotic disease which occurs in humans as well. So what is the mode of transmission? It usually occurs to humans via infected fruit bats, via porcupines, non-primates. So they may do transmission. But once it comes in humans, then human to human transmission. Human to human transmission, it occurs via body fluids, secretions, semen, vaginal secretions, semen secretions, sweat, body secretions, body fluid, urine, and these things. It can also spread by fomites or by material substances which may be infected. So basically it's person to person spread, usually by contact, not by direct touch. It does not spread skin to skin, but infected skin may transmit the disease to other person. So that is the reason that human to human transmission occurs by so fast it occurs, and it is not by mosquito, which is the wrong answer in the MCQ that we were seeing. If you talk about clinical features, that is also a special important MCQ over here, that if you talk about the clinical features of Ebola disease, it has basically 3 stages. The first stage is called as a dry stage, then we have a wet stage, and then we have a bleeding stage or a complication stage. In the dry stage, there is a lot of fever, intense fever, sudden onset of high-grade fever with intense body ache and headache. In the wet stage, there is vomiting and diarrhea. And in complication phase, there is hemorrhage, which may lead to bleeding, or it may be leading to some other smaller bruises, or there may be some organ failures in terms of liver failure, or there could be renal failure. What is the most common cause of death? Renal failures are usually the cause of death in Ebola disease. So if you talk about the prevention and control, there is no prevention and control. There is the only way to manage Ebola is symptomatic treatment. We don't have a drug for Ebola. It is symptomatic treatment. There is IV fluid resuscitation, and symptomatically we need to treat it. But there is a vaccine which is under trial, and it is giving positive outcomes, that is RVSV ZIBOV. This is the vaccine which is currently under trial for Ebola, and it is a multi-drug randomized control vaccine trial which is currently going on in Africa. So Ebola it's a dreaded disease. Ebola was the outbreak occurred in 2017-18. In August 2018, it was declared as public health emergency of international concerns in August 2018 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And just recently, 2 days back on 25th of June, the WHO declared the 10th outbreak was over for Ebola. So Ebola is a bad disease. It's a dreaded disease. So which of the following is incorrect for Ebola? Nosocomial, it can occur by contact. Belongs to Flavoviridae, that's correct. Spreads by direct contact, that is correct. So the answer which is not correct is mosquito transmission. This is the false option. Next MCQ. COVID prevention is done by all except use of mask, hand washing, ethanol 70%, glutaraldehyde 1%. See, COVID prevention, COVID 2019, it's a dreaded pandemic, and I know many of you all are working in COVID wards, and you must be knowing a hell lot of things about COVID things. So please remember that COVID, what is the best way of prevention? The only researches which have shown, I'm not talking from my own personal, it's all literature based, it's all evidence based, that the only thing which has shown to have good amount of COVID prevention is boosting immunity and hand washing. Hand washing is the best thing for COVID prevention. So hand washing is obviously done. Use of mask. This is kind of controversial, plus or minus. I told you AIIMS examiners, they are known for asking controversial thing. Use of mask. See, mask will not prevent, if a person is wearing a mask, if I wear a mask, it will not prevent me from getting COVID infection. It will prevent, but the chances are decreasing, but it does not give an absolute, like a very high amount of decrease. But what is the most important use of mask is that the people who are infected, if they wear the mask, the chances of the infected person to spread the virus in community decreases by a substantial number if the person is wearing a mask. So mask is primarily important for stopping the spread of disease from the infected person. Okay, and therefore we can say it helps in prevention. So it is important. I cannot say it is not important. So use of mask definitely is there. Hand washing definitely is there. Ethanol 70%. I think most of you know that hand sanitizer should have the alcohol content of more than 70%. Glutaraldehyde 1%. It's a confusing option. In fact, when I first time saw the MCQ, I said glutaraldehyde is given, but I somehow you may get confused. It is not hypochlorite. It is the hypochlorite, which is the disinfectant of choice, which is used in 1%. Hypochlorite 1% and glutaraldehyde 2% is used. Glutaraldehyde 2%. Let's have a few points about glutaraldehyde 2%. Glutaraldehyde is not used in 1% concentration. Glutaraldehyde is used in a 2% concentration. It is a high level disinfectant. MCQs on this. It does not act in its general property. The only way that it can act is in the alkaline form. So in alkaline form, in the pH of 7.5 to 8.5, it is most active, right? With a concentration of 2%, with a concentration of more than 2%. What are the uses? It is used for disinfecting a lot of clinical and laboratory equipment, for respiratory equipment, for spirometers, for ICU equipments, right? For transducers, the ultrasound, the ICU equipments, all these are disinfectant using glutaraldehyde 2%. Please remember, it is MCQ, it is non-corrosive, but it has to be used with caution. Why? Because it is toxic and expensive. Therefore, it is not used as a general disinfectant. It is a high level disinfection. So glutaraldehyde 2% is used as high level disinfectant. The general disinfectant that we use is hypochlorite solution, that is in 1% concentration. And for COVID prevention also, hypochlorite 1% is recommended by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. Let's go with the next MCQ. Isolation of virus for COVID vaccine production requires what laboratory level? So this is also a very, very important MCQ. Please remember that BSL-2 level is required for specimen handling. It is for serology, for viral concentration methods as precipitation method or membrane filtration method. So BSL-2 is primarily, these days you must be knowing that COVID testing is being done in all the wastewaters and in almost household waters also. So because there are research reports which are coming that COVID might be present in wastewaters. So all these specimens which are handled for COVID serology, for COVID specimen handling, viral concentration methods, we use the BSL-2 level. But for virus isolation, we have to use BSL-3. So BSL-3 is primarily used for two things. It is used for viral isolation and it is used for characterization of the viral components, from the SARS culture. So from the SARS culture, if you want to segregate the viral components, you want to understand the viral genome, for all these things we require the BSL-3, which is an upgraded version, and highly sophisticated methodology is used for biosafety level 3, which is required for isolation. So please remember, keep it very simple. For specimen handling, for serology, use BSL-2, and BSL-3 is used for virus isolation, for culture, and for characterization of the viral particles. Next MCQ, antibody testing for COVID-2 depends on. This is an interesting MCQ. I would say that it actually gets the feel of the student that do you understand why we do COVID testing, or on what principle do we do COVID testing, and on what principle will we have the restart plan which is carrying on in different countries. You must be knowing that US had a lot of antibody testing and there were a lot of controversies on that related to antibody testing. So there's the same question. Antibody testing depends on what? Does it depend on the viral load, incubation period, past infected or now asymptomatic or symptomatic patient? See, let's try to rule out options and let's try to understand what's happening. If you have a symptomatic patient, you would not like to do antibody testing. You'll probably do antigen testing or a serology, or you would like to do the PCR test. So symptomatic patient, antibody test does not carry any rule because that patient is already symptomatic. He's showing the signs of COVID infection. Incubation period has nothing to do with antibodies. Antibodies usually take 4 to 7 days to come up. So IgM, the instant antibody which will come up, will minimum take 4 days to 7 days, although research is still going on that it may take more than 7 days or even less than 3 days. So it does depend on viral load. I don't say yes or no, it may depend, because small infections may have lesser antibody. We don't know yet. But yes, we do know that if the patient is past infected and now asymptomatic, whether he was cured or not cured, or whether he has built up the immunity, how would you come to know? You will come to know by antibody testing. Antibody testing is for past infected and now asymptomatic, or now treated or not treated, or cured, or the person's immunity has overcome probably the COVID infection, and that is the role of antibodies over here. So I would like to mark option C as the best answer from whatever options are given right now in this MCQ you see. What is the level of protective antibody titer for healthcare workers for protection against tetanus? This is a relatively old MCQ. So it has come up a lot of times. It's a frequently asked MCQ. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. It's a direct question, direct answer. The answer is that the patient should all the time have more than 0.01 international units per ml. I would like to discuss a small point over here that, see, don't take this understanding that if the patient is having more than 0.1 international units, the patient will not get tetanus. Or if it is less than 0.1, the patient may get tetanus. No, it's not the case. The evidence is still not there that what is the absolute number. But research has shown that more than 0.01 international units will give a good amount of safety and prevention from tetanus infection, but there is no absolute risk, or there is no chance of absolute protection. Okay, so please remember, complete immunity is just a misnomer. It's just a confusing term, and in reality, in science, it does not exist that there is complete protection or there is complete risk. But yes, more than 0.1 is the answer over here in this MCQ. So let's move on to the next MCQ. Which of the following is the best for post-exposure prophylaxis of HIV due to needle prick injury? Zidovudine, lamivudine, or lopinavir, ritonavir, lamivudine or nevirapine, or zidovudine or nevirapine. So this question has generated a lot of controversy, and it has generated a lot of doubt among the students. So just have a look at this guideline. Which of the following is the best? So the question is asking about the best for post-exposure prophylaxis. So if you look at the resources, the NACO does say that 2-drug guideline is the best answer, but there is also a 3-drug which now the NACO recommends. In January 2020, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, they announced a guideline for all the infection prevention control guidelines. So the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare infection prevention and control guidelines were issued in this year, January 2020, which recommended the 3-drug schedule, direct answer, 3-drug schedule for the HIV post-exposure. WHO already says 3-drug. So now slowly the country, NACO, has also moved from 2-drug to the 3-drug schedule. So the best drugs is tenofovir and lamivudine, that is the base. Nevirapine under no circumstances is the answer. It is not used for post-exposure. It is only used for prevention of mother-to-child transmission of infection. So tenofovir, lamivudine is the basic. Alongside, we can use lopinavir or ritonavir boosted combination, or we can use efavirenz. So the best answer would be to have tenofovir, lamivudine and lopinavir, ritonavir boosted combination. If this is not available, we go with tenofovir, lamivudine with efavirenz. In time to come, I'm way before the guidelines, so guidelines are not yet there, but they will be there in our country in this year or by next year. That very soon we will be replacing efavirenz with dolutegravir. So, but that is when the guidelines will come, we'll discuss. But right now you need to remember that tenofovir, lamivudine and lopinavir, ritonavir boosted combination is the best post-exposure prophylaxis. So as far as this MCQ is concerned, they have put zidovudine instead of tenofovir. That's fine, but in fact it should be tenofovir if we talk about this technically. So the best option that I would like to mark over here is tenofovir or zidovudine with lamivudine with lopinavir, ritonavir boosted combination. So that is what the latest 2020 guidelines are. So let's have a look at the next MCQ. A healthcare worker had an accidental needle prick injury while giving treatment to hepatitis B patient. What is the management need to be done for the healthcare person? You can see that the patient is hepatitis HBs antigen reactive or positive, and the physician or the healthcare worker is having anti-HBs of 91 international units per liter. So please remember that as far as hepatitis B vaccine is concerned, whenever we give the full 3 doses or complete vaccine for immunization for hepatitis B or pre-exposure prophylaxis for hepatitis B, the person anti-HBs levels are more than 100 international units per liter. That is the optimum that we achieve. And we say that below 10 international units, there is a risk of infection. But now the recent guidelines are that even below 10 international units per liter anti-HBs level, the hepatitis infection that will occur in a person will be very mild and will be self-limiting. So there is no need of giving the booster vaccines again and again. So earlier we were giving booster vaccines when the anti-HBs level was below 10. So now that is also not the recommendation. Over here in this healthcare worker, the anti-HBs is pretty nice. It is 91 international units per liter. So no immunization is needed as he is adequately immunized. So please remember earlier it was less than 10, but now this also is almost redundant and we don't consider less than 10 as well. Next MCQ, aerosol protection is used in which of the following? Influenza A, measles, whooping cough or diphtheria. So a lot of protections are there. We can have different types of protection. We can have something called as contact protection where the person needs to wear the personal protective equipment. We can have respiratory protection. The respiratory protection can be of 2 types. We can have an aerosol protection, or we can have a droplet protection. Okay, so aerosol, I think it's common sense now. Aerosol is something which is very minute and that's the droplet nuclei, which can spread very fast and they can spread to longer distances. And droplets are spreading to lesser distances, and they do spread, but we need a slightly lesser amount of protection for that. So in that sense, you can have something called as ATDs and you can have DTDs. Aerosol transmittable diseases or droplet transmittable diseases. The aerosol transmittable diseases, aerosol transmittable diseases are very important to remember. It is TB, measles and chickenpox. Example is TB, measles and chickenpox. The droplet transmittable diseases, these are the droplet transmittable diseases. The droplet transmittable diseases are also important. They can be like measles, they can be, for example, we can have mumps, diphtheria, influenza, rhinoviruses. So these are droplet borne infections. So please try to understand that aerosol transmittable diseases, they require much more stringent criteria. For example, they need more than N95 or more mass. They need complete personal protective equipment, complete personal protective equipment. They also need negative pressure, airborne infection, isolation rooms. So negative pressure, airborne infection, isolation, these are AIIR rooms. These have negative pressure while the aerosol is being generated. So any aerosol generating procedure will require the aerosol transmittable diseases, and COVID-19 is also one of the COVID-19 is also under the ATD, aerosol transmittable diseases. So as far as this MCQ is concerned, I would like to mark measles because that's a typical example that we give for aerosol protection. Next MCQ, which of the following is true regarding the Nikshay Poshan Yojana? A lot of times this MCQ has come and it is a frequently asked MCQ. It's a frequently asked MCQ. Which of the following is a Nikshay Poshan Yojana? True for the Nikshay Poshan Yojana. Nikshay Poshan Yojana, if you would have watched my module number 37 on the Marrow PSM video modules or the conceptual review of PSM 3rd edition, page 536, I have reiterated again and again that this is a recent new addition into the program, that we are giving giving rupees 500 to all patients for their nutritional support, 500 per month. So I assume that 500 per week would not be a good answer. Daily cooked meals is not an answer. Covers all adults and girls is also not an appropriate answer. The best answer over here is DBT. DBT means direct benefit transfer. So direct benefit transfer of 500 INR per month to all TB patients under the Nikshay Poshan Yojana. So remember this, it's easy to remember. Next MCQ. Diseases not screened under RBSK. Congenital glaucoma, congenital cataract, retinopathy of prematurity, or vitamin A deficiency. It's a direct MCQ, although I do not like such kind of MCQs because disease is not screened under RBSK. In fact, Rashtriya Bal Swasthya Karyagram screens many diseases, and it's not very convenient to remember all the diseases. That's so bad. But anyways, we should remember the most important ones. That is, it includes vitamin A deficiency. It includes vitamin D deficiency. It includes severe acute malnutrition. It includes goiter. It does not include iodine deficiency disease as such, but includes the bigger thing, that is goiter, right? And of course, it does include anemia. That's the most important because anemia is such a big problem in India. It also includes congenital deafness and congenital cataract and congenital heart diseases, retinopathy of prematurity. So if you see all these diseases which are under the RBSK Rashtriya Bal Swasthya Karyagram, you can see that congenital glaucoma is not a disease which is screened under the RBSK Rashtriya Bal Swasthya Karyagram. Moving to the next MCQ. Under Anemia Mukt Bharat program, the dose of elemental iron and folic acid for adults and girls is 100 milligram, 500 microgram, so on and so forth. So this Anemia Mukt Bharat program guidelines, it is a frequently asked MCQ, and it was asked last year as well, and it is an expected topic which is asked again and again. So let's have a look at the Anemia Mukt Bharat guidelines again. I think we have already discussed much in detail in the video modules that Anemia Mukt Bharat to pregnant females, we are giving iron folic acid, we are giving to reproductive females, we are giving to adolescent girls and boys. So all girls who are in school or out of school, and to all the boys 10 to 19 years out in school, and children 5 to 9 years of age, all children 6 months to 5 years of age as well. So this MCQ had asked about the adolescent girls. Please remember that adolescent girls we are giving weekly weekly iron folic acid tablet. Each tablet contains 60 milligram of elemental iron and 500 micrograms of folic acid, sugar coated blue color tablet. Red color tablet is only for the women of reproductive age group and for the pregnant females. For adolescent girls we are giving blue color tablet. For children we are giving pink color tablet. This is your prospective MCQ. So in this MCQ we had asked, the AIIMS had asked about the iron and folic acid for adolescent girls. It is 60 and 500 micrograms given as weekly doses. So we have 60 and 500 micrograms given as weekly doses. 60 milligram iron and 500 folic acid. The next MCQ is the HIV sentinel surveillance includes all of the following populations except long distance truckers or pregnant females, patients to STD clinics, or single male migrants. So if you recall that the HSS, what is HSS? HIV sentinel surveillance. The HSS was conducted in year 2016-17 last. In this year 2016-17, there was the 15th round was conducted. The 15th round of HIV sentinel surveillance was conducted. In this sentinel surveillance, it was found that the HIV prevalence was maximum in the intravenous drug users. It was maximum in the intravenous drug abusers. It is up to whooping 6.2% intravenous IDU people were having HIV. It was also seen that HIV among the ANC females is 0.28, and ANC females are the proxy indicator. ANC females are the proxy indicators for the population. They are the proxy indicator for the general population. So what is the prevalence of HIV in the ANC? We consider that that is the same prevalence we will get in the general population. So therefore we say that the HIV in the general population is 0.28% prevalence. Now in this HSS 2016, it was 17. It was seen that in 2012-13, the last HSS was conducted in 2013. So till 2013, the STD sites were also incorporated into the HIV sentinel surveillance. You're getting it? So the STD sites are now slowly being washed off. Why? Because the data tends to be biased. And earlier we were using the STD sites because we did not have a very robust HIV sentinel surveillance among the migrants, among the truck drivers, among the commercial sex workers. So those things were lacking. So we relied more on the STD clinics. But we already know that this data is biased. So now in 2016-17, we have a robust system in the other areas, and therefore STD clinics were dropped off. So patients attending STD clinics are no more considered under the HIV sentinel surveillance. So we have these groups. You can see that we are having these groups only. These are 7 groups. I think you can see that there is high risk groups. Then you have the bridge population, and then you have the general population. I already told you that the ANC females are the proxy indicator of the general population. So that is included. High risk groups: commercial sex workers, female sex workers, male to male, IDUs, HNTG, Hijra, and the transgender population. Bridge population, that is the single male migrants and long distance truckers. So that is the bridge population. So these 7 groups are included. Fisherman is out. fishermen were also included, they are out. TB sites were also included, they are out. STD sites are also out. So these 3 sites are now out of the HIV sentinel surveillance. So the HIV sentinel surveillance 2016-17, they took the truck drivers, they took the pregnant females and the single migrant male workers, but not the STD clinics. Let's go to the next MCQ. Choice of contraception in female with heart disease. Such an easy MCQ. I think you must have heard a lot about this from gynae faculty, Dr. Sakshi ma'am. But we also discussed in our modules the choice of contraception in a female with heart disease. Condom, some people would say yes or no. Today is not an answer. DMPA injection is in fact contraindicated in people with heart disease, with stroke, with high blood pressures. Condom is a plus minus thing. Why? Because it does not offer the best contraception. It is not the choice of contraception. It is one of the options available if you cannot use an IUD or IUCD, but condom will have only 50% efficacy, right? So the effective sterilization is pretty low, or it has a high Pearls index, it has a high failure rate. So therefore condom is not a very good answer. Today is not an answer. Today, what is today? Today is a vaginal sponge, right? So vaginal sponge would not be a very good answer, again because of the efficacy of the contraception. DMPA, because of the metabolic side effects, is not a good answer. The best answer over here would be intrauterine copper device, choice of contraception in female with heart disease. This is the easiest question that you can ever imagine in a superb examination like All India Institute of Medical Sciences AIIMS exam, PG entrance exam. What is MMR? MMR is maternal mortality ratio. So what is the definition of MMR? Number of maternal deaths in population occurring within 42 days of termination of pregnancy by the total number of live births in the population per lakh is known as the maternal mortality ratio. So this is one of the most easiest MCQ. We would not like to spend much time on this. Any doubts, please feel free to ask in the comments box. Moving forward with the next MCQ, the criteria for SAM in an infant is all except. So what is SAM? SAM is severe acute malnutrition. So there are 2 basic ways to diagnose SAM. So one is a clinical assessment. Clinical assessment can be done by 2 subtypes. So one is visible muscle wasting or severe wasting. Severe wasting. It includes muscle wasting in the gluteal region. So this could be an MCQ, potential MCQ, muscle wasting in the gluteal region. Other could be visible wasting. One is visible severe wasting, another is loss of subcutaneous tissue. Subcutaneous tissue or fat or prominent bony structure. Example for this, or the area where we see this, is thorax. So the chest area, this is potential MCQ, this is a clinical assessment. Now the WHO gives a anthropometric measurement, and this is the clinical diagnosis, anthropometric diagnosis, where the weight for height, if it is less than -3 standard deviation or -3 Z-score. That is the criteria number 1. Criteria number 2 is mid-upper arm circumference, MUAC, mid-upper arm circumference is less than 11.5 centimeters, but it is only done in age of 6 to 59 months. If the child age is 6 to 59, then we can do. Third criteria to be labeled as SAM is presence of bilateral pedal edema. But that is only possible in case of a child with kwashiorkor. So in case of kwashiorkor, bilateral pedal edema. So please remember these 3 criteria. You need to repeat with me. The 3 criteria are weight for height less than 3, mid-arm circumference less than 11.5, and bilateral pedal edema. So based on that, the criteria for SAM is all except mid-arm circumference less than 15, that is a criteria. Weight for height less than -3, that is a criteria. Weight for age is not the criteria. So that will be our answer over here. Bilateral pedal edema is the correct answer. So over here I would like to mark weight for age less than 3 standard deviations. The next MCQ is neonatal seizures are related with which nutritional deficiency? Thiamine, riboflavin, iodine or pyridoxine? See, pyridoxine is the best answer over here. By B6 or pyridoxine dependent syndrome can be of two broad categories. We can have a pyridoxine dependent seizure, or we can have a pyridoxine partially responsive seizure. So the pyridoxine dependent seizures, these are typical intractable seizures which usually begin within few hours of birth. They are due to severe B6 deficiency, and they are not responding, usually they do not respond to conventional anticonvulsants. And we need to give massive big doses of pyridoxine, parenteral pyridoxine, which is way more than the physiological pyridoxine levels. Partially responsive seizures, these are atypical seizures which may occur due to B6 deficiency and may soften by B6 administration, but they do not fully recover. So we do not know much about the partially responsive seizures, but pyridoxine dependent seizures require massive doses of B6 pyridoxine, parenteral pyridoxine. If you talk about pyridoxine a little bit more about the vitamin B6, the B6 deficiency can lead to CNS abnormalities, especially in newborns. That's what we were discussing about the seizures. It can also lead to GI abnormalities in terms of vomiting or diarrhea. It can also lead to dermatological or skin malformations or skin abnormalities in terms of dermatitis, glossitis, or it can also lead to anemia. So B6 deficiency is seen in newborns developing seizures which do not respond to conventional anticonvulsants. Then we give the pyridoxine. So if you talk about the requirement of pyridoxine, the requirement of vitamin B6 in normal adults, it is 2 milligram per day. In pregnant and lactating females, it's slightly more of 2.5 milligrams per day, right? Pyridoxine is predominant vitamin which is found predominantly in meat, but also the vegetarian sources would be whole grains and nuts, basically walnuts. So, but B6 is predominantly found in meat. Next MCQ, diphtheria vaccine belongs to which type? So it is such an easy MCQ. Again, it's very like one of the most dreamt MCQs which you would like to have in AIIMS exam. Diphtheria vaccine belongs to which type? Toxoid, polysaccharide conjugate or a killed vaccine? So I think all of us already know that live vaccines are yellow fever, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. And then you also have influenza live vaccine. You also have a JE live vaccine strain, right? You also have influenza live vaccines. The killed vaccine would be pertussis vaccine. You also have a JE killed vaccine, killed strain. We also have for influenza killed strain. Toxoid vaccine, diphtheria is the answer. Diphtheria and tetanus are toxoid vaccines. What are conjugate vaccines? See, conjugate vaccines, polysaccharide vaccine, the outer coating of the bacteria that has polysaccharide. So if we just take the outer coating and put it into a vaccine form, that is the polysaccharide vaccine. And conjugate vaccine is where we take the outer component and some of the portion of the bacteria and we combine them. That is a coat along with portion of the bacteria that forms a conjugate vaccine. Right, so a lot of different types of vaccines are discussed, but over here in this MCQ, direct answer, what is a toxoid vaccine? That is diphtheria and tetanus. Moving on to the next MCQ, identify the vector with trans-ovarial transmission from the life cycle shown below. Louse, hardtick, trombiculid mite or triatomine bug. So anyways, it's over here, it's a direct MCQ. It's not a bug, right? This thing is not a bug. It can either be a louse, a tick or a mite. So I think I told you in the video modules also, we discussed it over social media platforms also, that how to differentiate between a louse, mite and a tick. So the tick is a oval structure. It will have a head or it may not have a head. If there is no head, it is called as a soft tick. If there is a head which is visible, if the head is visible, it is called as a hard tick. Over here you see that there is a head, but it also has a segmented body. It's not an oval structure. So it's not a tick. So this is a hard tick, and this is on this axis, this side, this is a soft tick. Okay. Now what is a louse? Louse will be an elongated creature. Okay. So please remember that how do you differentiate between a mite and a tick? It is slightly difficult to differentiate between a mite and a tick. The ticks will be oval structures, will be oval creatures, and they will not be having segmented bodies. So over here you can see that there is segmentation. And if you see the itch mite, it will have very strong thick anterior legs. It will have very strong thick anterior legs. So that is typical for an itch mite. So if we just look at the life cycles of the mites and the louse, you can just see what is this creature, what is this you see on the screen on this side, on your left side, this yellow colored creatures. So you can see that this is a louse. It is an elongated, it is a louse. Remember L louse, remember L long. It is a long creature, you can see, and it always will have claws. You can see it will always have claws. So that's the best, easiest way to differentiate between louse and other things. What do you see here? Can you see any segmentation? No, we cannot see any segmentation. These are probably these are ticks, right? So these are ticks. Okay. So what do you see here? So you see here that there is a tick which is having a head. So it is probably a hard tick. It is probably a hard tick. So what is this on the image that is shown here? It is a mite. So please remember, how do you differentiate between a mite and a tick? It is really hard. Mites are small. They are not visible by naked eye. Mites are very small and they may have segmented bodies, or in case it is an itch mite, it will have thick anterior legs. In the mite that you see over here, it is segmented. You can see a thorax, you can see an abdomen, you can see a head, right? In the ticks, you do not see them. So ticks can be soft or hard. You see a head, hard tick, no head, it is a soft tick, right? So that's the way to identify the vectors. So with that, we finished the discussion of the AIIMS module. So now we have finished the AIIMS June 2020 MCQs for community medicine subject. I would like to discuss with you a very important topic. Many of you have asked me on social media platform on what is the best way to prepare community medicine or the best strategy to revise community medicine. I would like to tell you that during these COVID-19 pandemic times, you're not alone. We are all together in this. You might be restrained in your homes or you might be super busy in your hospitals, but you should utilize this time to have that positive energy from within you. It always depends on you whether you want to see the half glass full or you want to see the half glass empty. You have such a beautiful Marrow platform on which you have all the faculty experts giving video lectures to you. You have your Q banks with good quality MCQs. So let us try to generate that positive sense to use this time more appropriately. If you talk of community medicine subject, let us say it is July right now. July, August, September, October, November, December. You have like maybe roughly around 4 to 5 months in hands. So in 4 or 5 months, how to study this subject? I'm not of that person that I will tell you that you should take this chapter first, don't do this demography, you do MCH or you do national health programs. Everything is important. Or I'm not of this opinion that you do QBank first and then watch videos and then theory. It all depends on your own strategy. Something works for me, that thing might not work for you. So I would request you all to strategize your own plan. But if you have your 4 months, this I can tell you that community medicine is a bigger subject. So in your initial part of preparation, I would recommend that you do all the conceptual topics and you do all the major topics in the initial part of preparation, like 4-5 months, you do community medicine right now. Now, when you are near the exam, at that time, you have to do national health programs. A lot of guidelines change, recent updates are there, vaccines are there, so many new things keep on changing, data changes, right? So those things you study before, like around 10-15 days before the exam. That is going to give you the maximum benefit. So I don't want you to study community medicine, again revise next month, again do that. It's not required. You take up community medicine, finish off PSM subject in 10-12 days. Once you finish off PSM subject in 10-12 days, and then you should revise it approximately 15 days, 10 days before the exam. You see all the major updates which are available on social media platforms, on Marolinks group, on Facebook groups, my Telegram group, anywhere. You must have joined somewhere. You follow the updates, and those things you keep a note of them and you revise it sometime near the exam. I would also like to tell you that if you're appearing for AIIMS exam, initially we used to think that, of course, this time biostats was less amount asked, but usually biostats is important. But I want to discuss with you that if you're giving AIIMS exam, PGI exam, there are specific topics which you should lay stress upon, especially for AIIMS exam. National health programs, the new guidelines, communicable disease. We have seen an increasing trend of questions from these three topics. Lot of questions. There was time when I was doing a PG entrance exam, when I was preparing for PG entrance, there was time when the whole stress was on MCH, demography, epidemiology and biostats. But now times change, right? So things have changed, the MCQ pattern has changed, the examiners have changed. Right now, more stress is upon in AIIMS exam, national health programs, communicable disease, and how to prevention aspect of all the diseases. If you talk about PG entrance exam, vaccines, immunization has been their super favorite all the time. Environment, non-communicable disease, because the WHO Center for non-communicable disease, for diabetes, for lung diseases, respiratory diseases is PGI Chandigarh. So whenever you're preparing for these type of exams, you should be knowing what intricate details you need to know. But overall, grossly speaking, you study community medicine right now, then you take off, do other subjects, and then you re-revise it before the exam. I would also like to tell you that in case you like community medicine, you may be motivated to study all the subjects. Motivation, I personally feel, is a very short lasting. It is something that will ignite the spark within you. But if you're appearing for the PG entrance exam, the most important thing is that you have to persist with that hard work. Now, that motivation will fade off after 2 days, 3 days, 5 days. That doesn't work for a very long time. What will work is your inner enlightenment. So how will that inner enlightenment come? That I feel will come only when there is need for you to give the exam and to clear the exam. When there is felt need, automatically you will get that enlightenment, you will have persistence, you will have perseverance, and you will keep on doing the same thing again and again. In nutshell, I would say that you have to be honest with yourself. In these 4-5 months, give your best shot. So that after 4-5 months, if you stand in front of a mirror, you can say that I gave my best shot. So you plan your 4-5 months in such a manner that you are going to give your best output. Stay honest to yourself. Look at the mirror and say that, did I do real hard work which I was supposed to do and which I am capable of doing? Did I do that? Yes or no? If answer is yes, keep on the good work, you will succeed. If you're honest with yourself and you are able to stick to your timings, I think that the sky is yours, the earth is yours. You will be successful in this exam. Just stay honest with yourself and focus. The only thing is revise, revise and revise all the important topics in my subject at least, and stay focused. Any doubt you have, you're most welcome to always ask on the Marolinks group or the Facebook groups or the Telegram group. You have multiple options. So stay focused. All the very best.